From the desert to the north, Qom stands like an island of distant gold. The cupolas of its mosques and its plump, generous minarets, an oasis of beauty at dawn, like the spires of a medieval English university. Its ancient center appears to reach up to heaven, but my train pulled in after dark. The suburbs thick with exhaust and dust and vast crowds, dark-jacketed, bearded men and black-veiled women moving like a tide towards a grim red brick building surrounded by big, muscular men with automatic rifles. My leftist student friend turned to me. Quote, "There is a trial," he shouted. "They are trying one of the Shah's men." End quote. I dumped my bag in a hotel, crammed between shops opposite the Friday mosque, pulled out my old clunker of a tape recorder, and ran back to what was already called the court. Warrant Officer Rustomi of the Shah's Imperial Army sat on a metal-framed chair on the stage of the Revolutionary Court, his hands clasped in front of him and his gaze fixed on the wooden door of the converted theater where he was now on trial. He was a middle-aged man and wore an untidy gray-brown beard. He had long ago been stripped of his artillery regiment uniform, and he appeared in court in a creased green anorak and a pair of dirty jeans, a crumpled figure relieved only by the snappy pair of built-up French shoes on his feet. He looked for all the world like a bored defendant awaiting judgment for a minor traffic offense, rather than a man who was waiting only for the legal niceties, if legal was the right word, of a death sentence. He was accused of killing anti-Shah demonstrators. The Islamic court in Qom had dispatched its fifth victim to the firing squad only 6 hours later. He was a local policeman accused of killing demonstrators in the revolution, the man who had appeared on the newspaper's front page, tied to the ladder, gritting his teeth in front of the firing squad. Someone had cruelly shown the newspaper to Rustomi. Maybe it was the inevitability of his sentence that made him so calm, sitting up there on the platform above us. Every few minutes he would take a packet of American cigarettes out of his pocket, and a gunman with a rifle, yes, an American rifle, slung over his shoulder, would step over to him, obligingly with a match. Rustomi dragged heavily on the cigarettes, and glanced occasionally over towards us with a kind of lifelessness in his eyes. There were more than 600 men, no women, in the audience, and most of them were talking of that morning's execution, although it was difficult to understand why the event should have occasioned any excitement. There had been no acquittals in the revolutionary courts, and the only punishment handed out had been death. The crowd had come to watch the prisoner, to see if he cried or pleaded for life or walked defiantly to the firing squad, to watch the mighty fallen. George Bernard Shaw once claimed that if Christians were thrown to the lions in the Royal Albert Hall in London, there would be a packed house each night. These excited men in the audience must have been wearing the same faces as the mobs that gathered before the guillotine during the French Revolution. You could see why death would be the only possible sentence as soon as Rustomi's trial started. An Islamic priest in long brown robes and a civilian lawyer appointed by the mosque walked onto the stage of the converted theater and announced that they were to act as prosecuting counsel and judges. Rustomi did not even glance at them. They sat at 2 iron desks, and behind them, fixed onto a star-like design of strip lights, was a crude oil painting of Ayatollah Khomeini. There was no doubt under whose authority this court was sitting. The mullah made a brief address to the crowd, stating that the trial would be held according to the rules of the Quran, and that the prisoner should be allowed to reply to the charges against him. The mullah was a tall, distinguished man, with a long white beard and a kind, honest face. The civilian lawyer looked angry and vindictive, and said something abusive to Rustomi before he sat down. The mullah waved a sheaf of papers in his hand, a series of written testaments by witnesses to anti-Shah demonstrations, each claiming that Rustomi had ordered his company of soldiers to fire at civilians. One by one, the witnesses were called from the audience to give their evidence, a process occasionally interrupted by shouting at the back of the theater, where more men were pushing their way through the doors and fighting for places in the court. Rustomi pulled his chair up to the mullah's desk and listened. The first witness was a young man with his shoulder in plaster, and the second witness limped onto the stage. They had seen Rustomi order his men to fire at the demonstrators, they claimed, and a third man ran onto the stage and yelled that Rustomi had broken through the door of a mosque and killed a boy hiding in the shrine. There was much discussion of dates and street names. There was, in fact, a genuine, if chaotic, attempt to define the events surrounding the shooting, before Rustomi stood up. The crowd bayed at him, and for several seconds the mullah did nothing. Rustomi looked down at us with an uncomprehending expression. He wanted to talk. Yes, he said, he had ordered his men to disperse the demonstrators, but he had told them to fire into the air. If anyone had been hit, it must have been a ricochet. There was a momentary silence in the court before another man, scarcely 20 years old, clambered onto the stage and pointed at Rustomi. "You're lying, you bastard," quote. He screamed before the judge ordered him off. Rustomi fought his corner against obviously impossible odds. He had no defense counsel. He admitted that on another day he had indeed fired his rifle into a crowd of people who were demanding the overthrow of the Shah. He had questioned the orders to open fire, he said, over his two-way radio, but his major had threatened him with a court-martial if he did not obey. At this, an old man in the theater leapt to his feet. Quote, "The Holy Quran does not allow any man to take that attitude," end quote, he shouted. Quote, "If a Muslim kills another Muslim, in those circumstances he is not true to his religion," end quote. The old man went on, abusing Rustomi, and the mullah with the wise, kindly face nodded in an agreeable fashion, and allowed the abuse to continue. Rustomi seemed on the verge of tears. Then the civilian lawyer walked around and shouted, "Liar," in the prisoner's ear. For a dreadful moment, I was reminded of those scratched archive films of the Nazi People's Court trying the plotters against Hitler's life in 1944, when Judge Roland Freisler, sorry if I mispronounced that, swore at the defendants. At the end of the first day in Qom, the civilian lawyer walked over to me smiling. Quote, "It's a fair trial we're giving him," and he said. "As you can see, we allow Rustomi to answer the charges," end quote. The court resumed next morning, and Rustomi watched unhappily as two members of his own riot squad condemned him as a murderer. Another soldier did bravely step forward to defend the prisoner, but he was ordered to shut up after being accused of muddling the date of the incident. When the mullah called a break for lunch, a man of about 30 walked up to me outside the theater. He was watched suspiciously by a group of Islamic guards, gunmen wearing the distinctive green armband that showed they were appointed by the mosque. It turned out to be Rustomi's brother, and he was a frightened man. There was no way we could talk there on the pavement, so we walked down a street together, followed by the gunmen from the court. Quote, "Do you think this is a fair trial?" End quote, he asked. My brother has no defense counsel. They told him to find one if he wants, but I have been to Tehran to the committee of lawyers, and I've spoken to 20 lawyers. Not one of them will take his case. This court has killed every prisoner it has tried." End quote. There was a sad pause while the man tried to stop himself from weeping. Quote, "My brother has a little boy. He has told the other children at his school that he will kill himself if the court killed his father." End quote. Then we said goodbye, and Rustomi's brother walked off, the gunmen mincing after him. That same afternoon, I asked Ayatollah Kazem Shariat Madari, one of Khomeini's closest advisors, why Rustomi was allowed no defense counsel. The white-bearded Ayatollah sat cross-legged on rich ornamental carpets. Quote, "A prisoner at an Islamic court should be allowed a lawyer to defend him," he said. "I do not know what is going on at this trial at Qom, I do not know the circumstances of this trial. I do not know the answer to your question." End quote. He was a gentle old man, and a moderate among the divines in the city of Qom. But what did moderate mean anymore? Shariat Madari simply had no idea what was going on in the courts, and I'm sure he preferred not to find out. I still have the tapes of the old man's excuses, and, far more difficult to listen to, the recordings of the trial, of the lawyer shrieking "liar" in Rustomi's ear, of the condemned man trying to explain his military rules, of his brother's tears outside the court. They carry an authentic, painful reality of injustice by the many against the few. Khomeini's ruling after Bazarjan's frantic visit to Qom did not spare the prisoners brought into the converted theater. Execution started again the morning after I left Qom, and although the identity of the victims was not at first made clear, one of them was a former soldier in the Shah's army. I knew his name. There would be no counter-coups in this revolution, no Operation Ajax, no CIA men operating from within the U.S. Embassy to buy up the Bazaris. Indeed, very soon there would be no U.S. Embassy. The demands for the return of the Shah were being made not for his restoration, but in order to put him on trial. Only when the head of the snake had been cut off would the revolution feel safe. Just as the Americans believed 24 years later that only the capture of Saddam Hussein would bring them tranquility in Iraq, so Khomeini and his retinue were convinced that only the death of the Shah, preferably hanged as a criminal in Iran for crimes against God, would free Iran from its corrupt past. And there's an asterisk that leads to, there were other odd parallels with America's later disaster in Iraq. The Shah, while still in power, always insisted that his enemies were, quote, communists and fanatics, end quote. President Bush was always claiming that America's enemies were, quote, Saddam remnants and foreign terrorists, end quote. Neither the Shah nor Bush could admit that they faced a popular domestic insurgency. And to return where we were, in reality, the Shah was already dying from cancer. Many Iranians saw in his pathetic exile the true justice of God, his cancer the ultimate divine vengeance against one who had sinned on earth. The Shah's gruesome odyssey through the hospitals of Central America, New York City, and eventually Cairo, gave grim satisfaction to the mullahs who had already ordered his assassination. Not long after his departure, I had sat at the feet of Sadiq Kalkali, the hanging judge, as he listed those of the Shah's family who had been sentenced to death in absentia. Around him sat a score or so of Revolutionary Guards who had been maimed in the Revolutionary War against the Kurds of northwestern Iran, each of them clacking his newly fitted artificial metal fingers, hands, and feet as the prelate outlined the fate that so surely awaited his aristocratic enemies. Kalkali it was who had sentenced a 14-year-old boy to death, who had approved of the stoning to death of women in Kermanshah, who earlier, in a mental asylum, would strangle cats in his prison cell. Gorbe, the cat, was what he was called. Quote, "The Shah will be strung up, he will be cut down and smashed," end quote, the cat told me. Quote, "He is an instrument of Satan," end quote. In fact, the Shah was a poor substitute for the devil, scarcely even the equal of Faustus, for he sold himself for the promise of worldly military power and seemingly everlasting American support. The chorus of harpies that pursued the Shah halfway around the world were the bickering, greedy surgeons, doctors, and nurses who bombarded the dying man with pills, blood platelets, and false hope. Agents of darkness who only too well represented the technology of the world to whom the Shah had long ago sold his soul. His erstwhile friends from that world, King Hussein of Jordan, King Khaled of Saudi Arabia, King Hassan of Morocco, the Swiss, the Austrians, President Carter and Margaret Thatcher, either terminated his residence, turned him away, or broke their promise to accept him when they realized the political cost. It was sobering to reflect that his only true friend, the only potentate to honor his word to Carter when the Americans wanted the old man to leave New York, was President Sadat of Egypt. President Torrijos of Panama, who gave temporary refuge to the Shah, and who wanted to seduce Queen Farah, but was swiftly given the brush-off by the Shahbanon, produced the pithiest obituary of the Light of the Aryans. Quote, "This is what happens to a man squeezed by the great nations. After all the juice is gone, they throw him away." End quote. In the event, the Shah died in Cairo on the 27th of July, 1980, and was lowered into a modest tomb in the Al-Rifai Mosque. Sorry for mispronouncing that. 6 years later, in the heat of summer, I went with an Iranian friend to look at his tomb. It was midday, and there was only one guardian in the mosque, an old, silver-haired man who, for a pittance, promised to take us into the last resting place of the man who thought he was the spiritual descendant of Cyrus the Great. There was a single marble slab, and resting upon it, a handwritten poem declaring eternal faith in the Shah from a member of the Javidan Guards. A spray of withered roses lay on the tomb. The old guardian wandered up to us and muttered, "Bakshish." He settled for 50 piastres. Sorry for mispronouncing that. 50 piastres. In the end, it cost the equivalent of 40 cents to sit at the feet of the King of Kings. The Islamic revolutionaries who now emerged behind Ayatollah Khomeini were oddly middle class. Men like Sadiq Kotbzeda, the head of the television service, later foreign minister, and later still executed for allegedly plotting against the Ayatollah, were graduates of American universities. They spoke English with American accents, which meant that they could appear surprisingly at ease on the U.S. television networks. Many, like the new Deputy Prime Minister Amir Abbas Antizam, flaunted their unproletarian origins. Quote, "I am proud that this has been a middle-class revolution." End quote. And Antizam announced to me one day. He leaned forward in his chair and tapped his chest. Quote, "I am proud of that," he repeated. By ministerial standards, his was a modest office with only 2 desks, a sofa, a clutter of chairs, and a telephone that purred unanswered in the corner. It would have been difficult to find anyone more middle class than Antizam, with his American education and well-traveled career as an engineer. Yet in his way, he was telling the truth. For while the physical power behind the revolution lay in those colossal street demonstrations by the urban poor and the Islamic revivalists, it was the middle class from the bazaar, the tens of thousands of merchants from the Middle East's large souk whom the Shah tried to tame with a system of guilds, that provided the economic backing for Khomeini's return. It was his merchant class and its alliance with the mullahs that emerged as the critical combination of secular and religious opposition. That is why Iran's revolution had until now generally avoided the more traditional path of such events, the looting of the homes and property of the rich. That is why you could still take a taxi across Tehran and drive into the northern suburbs beneath the mountains, to find that the luxury apartments and opulent townhouses with their tree-shaded verandas and goldfish ponds had been left untouched. Accumulated wealth had not been appropriated by the state. By late March of 1979, however, this had begun to change. In the north of Iran, around the Caspian, factories were being taken over by workers. Leftists had led the revolution east of Kurdistan, and the mosque had never held sway there, and property was confiscated. The interim government, appointed by Khomeini, was receiving reports of further confiscations near Mashhad, and the pattern was beginning to spread to Tehran. Just over a week earlier, Fariborz Adapor, one of the city's most prolific and outspoken journalists, was told that his father had been arrested. It turned out that Adapor Sr., who owned a small estate on the Caspian coast, had walked into his local Tehran bank to cash a check, and had been detained by the cashier who thought that if his customer looked rich, then he must indeed be wealthy, and that if he was indeed wealthy, then he must also be corrupt. Old Mr. Adapor, who had been a soldier in the imperial army, but retired from military service 27 years earlier, was 70 years old and deeply in debt. Nonetheless, he was collected from the bank by a heavily armed revolutionary comité and freighted off to the Kasser prison. At least this is where Feriboris Adapor thought his father was being held. No official statement had been issued by the comité, and even the government would not gain access to the jail. There were now an estimated 8,000 prisoners inside. There had been around 2,000 at the time of the Shah, and it took the Red Cross several weeks to gain admission. So it was not surprising that Adapor was angry. Quote, "This revolution has deteriorated into petty vengeance and tyranny. It can only be compared to the Jacobin terror of the French Revolution. The merchants in the bazaar have more money than my father, but they do not care about his fate, nor do the so-called religious leaders. I spoke on the phone to the local Ayatollah from our area of the Caspian, and he said that my father must be corrupt because he was rich. He would not even let me answer his accusation on the telephone. He just hung up." End quote. Adapor was daily expecting his own arrest, but 3 days after we spoke, his journalistic voice was silenced when Tehran's 2 English-language newspapers announced that they were suspending publication. The Tehran journal, for which Adapor wrote, gave economic reasons for its closure, but for weeks revolutionary comités had been denouncing the paper as anti-Islamic. Most of the staff had received anonymous phone calls threatening their lives. Adapor's parallel with the French Revolution, so much at variance with Edward Mortimer's enthusiasm, was not lost on the most dogmatic of Iran's new regime. Dr. Salamatian, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, a political aide at the Foreign Ministry, found an agreeable comparison. There were fewer executions in Iran than in the French or Russian revolutions, he said. When I pointed out to him that there were no firing squads at all after the 1974 Portuguese Revolution, he snapped back at me. Quote, "But in Portugal they were only getting rid of Caetano. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. We have been overthrowing more than 2,000 years of monarchy." End quote. This was a curious response, since the idea that Persia had lived under a seamless monarchy for 2,300 years was a figment of the Shah's imagination, a myth propagated to justify his authoritarian rule. That this rule was authoritarian was one of the few common denominators among those who supported the revolution, for the left in Iran already realized that the clerics were installing themselves in power. Quote, "Why condemn us for hunting down the Shah's murderers?" End quote, Salamatian said. And quote, "In the West, you kept the Nazi Rudolf Hess in prison in Germany. We regard the agents of Savak as Nazi-type criminals. You in the West put Nazis on trial. Why shouldn't we put our Nazis on trial?" End quote. And how could one argue with this when reporters like Derek Ive of the Associated Press had managed, very briefly, to look inside a Savak agent's house just before the revolution was successful? He entered the building when a crowd stormed through the front door. Quote, "There was a fish pond outside. There were vases of flowers in the front hall, but downstairs there were cells. In each of them was a steel bed with straps, and beneath it 2 domestic cookers. There were lowering devices on the bed frames so that the people strapped to them could be brought down onto the flames. In another cell, I found a machine with a contraption which held a human arm beneath a knife, and next to it was a metal sheath into which a human hand could be fitted. At one end was a bacon slicer. They had been shaving off people's hands." End quote. I found a pile of human arms in a corner, and in a further cell he discovered pieces of a corpse floating in several inches of what appeared to be acid. Just before the Shah's soldiers burst back into the rear of the building, he snatched some quick photographs of the torture apparatus. After the revolution, we were able to meet some of the Shah's top Savak agents. sitting in Evin prison in their open-neck shirts, winter cardigans, and corduroys, drawing nervously on American cigarettes, and the 18 prisoners looked nothing like the popular image of secret policemen. From the moment they were brought into the room, a dingy, rectangular office that doubled on occasions as a revolutionary court, these middle-aged, over-friendly men either smiled or just stared at us as government officials described them as criminals. But they had disturbing and sometimes frightening stories to tell. Hassan Sana, the economic and security advisor to the deputy head of Savak, talked of British intelligence cooperation with the Shah, a friendly liaison which, he claimed, prompted British agents to pass to their Iranian counterparts information about Iranian students in Britain. Sana, a chain smoker with dark glasses and an apparent passion for brightly colored shirts, said that British assistance enabled Savak to watch or arrest students on their return to Tehran from London. He spoke, too, of how Savak agents were flown from New York by the CIA for lessons in interrogation techniques at a secret American military base, a mysterious journey that took 4 hours flying across the United States in an aircraft with darkened windows. We had earlier toured the Savak Interrogation Center in central Tehran, where former inmates described how they had been tortured. A black-tiled room with a concrete floor was all that remained of the chamber. Almost identical to the one I've had discovered, where prisoners were roasted on beds over gas burners. In Evin, for one terrible moment, Mohammed Sadafi, a Savak agent who had been a weightlifter, was confronted by a man whose daughter died in Sadafi's personal custody. Quote, "You killed my daughter," the man shouted. "She was burned all over her flesh until she was paralyzed. She was roasted." End quote. Sadafi glanced briefly at the man. Quote, "Your daughter hanged herself after 7 months in custody," he replied quietly. The father said there was not even a sheet in the prison from which an inmate could hang herself. Yes, there was, Sadafi said. He had himself seen the laundry bills at Evin. Upon such horror, the Shah's regime was maintained, and upon such fearful scenes the revolution was fueled. If there was a cause for surprise in Iran at this early stage of the new regime, it was not that the revolution had claimed so many victims among the Shah's retinue, but that it had claimed so few. But the revolution was unfinished. It was not going to end at that friendly bourgeois stage at which the Portuguese grew tired, nor was there any common ground between the new Islamic Republic and the People's Democracy that Iranian left-wing groups had been propagating. The left was now more active. There were firefights in the streets every night, and the situation would only be exacerbated by Iran's constantly worsening social conditions. Even Khomeini's described the country as a slum, and there's an asterisk that goes to. There were now 3.5 million people out of work, about 25% of the workforce, and 50% of the population lived in grossly overcrowded cities. The food shortages were not just caused by Khomeini's insistence that Muslims should in future refuse to eat frozen meat. They were brought about by Iran's proud refusal to import more foreign goods. Yet until the previous winter, the country had been relying on $2 billion of imported foodstuffs. The security authorities of the new Islamic State remained convinced, however, that some in the new government regarded the United States as a potential partner rather than the great Satan of the street demonstrations. And they were right. After the U.S. Embassy was seized in November 1979 by the Muslim students following the line of the Imam, Iranian security men found tons of shredded U.S. diplomatic correspondence, which they spent months reconstructing by laboriously pasting documents back together. The papers included an embarrassing quantity of material about Abbas Amir and Intizam, the deputy prime minister, and his contacts with the U.S. government. At first, this was on a formal basis. The American embassy remained open after the revolution, and U.S. officials routinely met Iranian foreign ministry staff to arrange the repatriation of American military staff and civilians, and the embassy told Entezam in March 1979 that, quote, the United States desires to normalize its relations with Iran at a steady pace, end quote. Entezam replied, according to the documents, that, quote, his government also wanted a good relationship with the United States. The Prime Minister, Bazarjan, had recently expressed this sentiment publicly, end quote. Within a few days, however, Entezam was expressing his government's desire to share intelligence information with USG, the U.S. government. Quote, Within a few days, however, Entezam was expressing the government's desire to, quote, share intelligence information with the U.S. government, end quote. The Americans had, incredibly, already given Entezam a paper on Afghanistan. The Iranians were increasingly fearful that the Soviet Union might invade their eastern neighbor, but now Entezam explained that his government was more concerned about, quote, internal security threats, end quote. According to the U.S. Embassy report of a further meeting in May, Entezam said that, quote, PGOI, Provisional Government of Iran, was concerned about possible meddling by Iraqis in Khuzestan province as well as authorities of PLO and Libyans, end quote. Entezam said that, quote, PGOI had information that George Habash, the leader of the Syrian-supported Popular Front of the Liberation of Palestine, had recently visited several Gulf countries, presumably with a view to causing trouble for Iran, end quote. The PLO's office in the southern Iranian city of Awaz was also causing concern, but shaking his head, Entezam said his government could do nothing about it, because it was Khomeini's desire that it be opened. This was incendiary material. Here was Entezam, who only a few weeks earlier was boasting to me about the middle-class nature of the revolution, discussing Iran's security fears with the CIA, not only revealing his own intelligence information, but expressing his exasperation with the most revered Islamic figure in the country for endangering that security. In June, Entezam was asking for U.S. information on Iraqi intentions towards Iran, but this time there had been frequent artillery exchanges across the Iran-Iraq border, and the U.S. Embassy I'm not sure how to pronounce that, quote, after remarking that he was not sure who cast the first stone, speculated on the possibility of the Iraqis attempting to create a prickly hedge along Iraq's border with Iran a la one-time British policy on the Duran line, end quote. Bruce Langan, the American charge held further meetings with Entezam, and within weeks, Entezam, known in the U.S. cable traffic by the rather unromantic codename SD/PLOD/I, was receiving direct visits from senior CIA officials. When he became an Iranian ambassador based in Sweden, Entezam was given an intelligence briefing by CIA agent George Cave, who was later to be a leading figure in the 1985-86 Contra scandal. In Tehran, there had been further meetings between the CIA and Bazarjan, Entezam, and Ibrahim Yazdi, the Iranian foreign minister. Cave himself later visited Tehran and agreed with Entezam that there should be briefings, again, I quote the reconstructed documents, quote, every 3 to 6 months, with spot information being passed if particularly important. Entezam asked if there could be a contact in Tehran to exchange information on a regular basis. Note, Cave was introduced as senior briefing officer from intelligence community. Term CIA was never used, end quote. When the American embassy in Tehran was invaded after the Shah had been admitted to the United States, the explosive nature of Entezam's CIA contacts was revealed in the shredded files that the young Iranian men and women were painstakingly pasting back together. Bazarjan and Yazdi were discredited and Intizam arrested and put on trial for treason, barely escaping execution when he was given a life sentence in 1981. Intizam always maintained that he was a true revolutionary, merely seeking to maintain relations with the Americans in the interests of Iran. Masome Ebtekar, among the principal invaders of the embassy, saw it quite differently. Quote, the CIA apparently believed that it could manipulate any revolution or political establishment if it could successfully infiltrate its top ranks early on. She was to write, in Iran, the agency was particularly intent on doing so. After all, it had plenty of past experience, end quote. According to Ebtekar, the, quote, students of the Imam, end quote, also found counterfeit identity cards and passports for CIA agents in the embassy, including stamps and seals for airport entry and exit visas in Europe and Asia, as well as 1,000 false Ghanaian passports. Other documents dealt with pro-monarchists, quote, who were involved in terror killings, end quote. But if another Operation Ajax was ever considered in Washington, it surely died in November 1979. Our own life in those early weeks of the Islamic Republic was not without its humor. As long as Iran kept to the system of free visas operating under the Shah, we could enter and leave Iran as often as we wished. I even flew to Dublin for a weekend break, leaving Tehran on a Friday morning, returning by Monday night, and only slowly did the regime's new laws affect us. For months, at the Intercontinental Hotel in Tehran, later renamed Layla, Rose after the symbol of revolution, we could still drink vodka with blinnies. But the ban on alcohol was quickly imposed. I still possess a memorable note from the Tehran hotel management pushed under my door on the 21st of March, 1979. Quote, due to the limited supply of alcoholic beverages in the country and the unexpected in the markups and the price of these items, the management has no alternative but to a 20% increase. Thank you, end quote. Not long afterwards, a revolutionary comité invited journalists to watch the destruction of the remaining stocks of satanic alcohol in the hotel cellars. As film cameras whirred, a gunman hurled Pol Roger champagne bottles into the bottom of the empty swimming pool, along with the finest French wines and upended boxes of Gordon's gin. From the 2-foot-deep field of glass at the bottom of the pool, the stench of alcohol permeated the hotel for days afterwards. A South Korean restaurant continued to elude the authorities, its staff burying cases of German beer in their gardens. Clients had to wait for 10 minutes until each beer can arrived at their table covered in earth. And the middle classes, so beloved of Intizam, continued to entertain. One evening I was invited to dinner at a villa of marble stone floors and tasteless pseudo-Baroque paintings in North Tehran, where a young couple entertained several Iranian writers and myself with poetry reading and a meal of pre-revolutionary abundance, along with obligatory glasses of homemade vodka. I was intrigued by the attractive hostess because she was rumored to have been one of the Shah's last mistresses. Whenever the Shah wished to make love to a woman, it was said she would be invited to a side door of his palace, would spend 2 hours with him in a discreet salon, and, before leaving, would be presented with a Labrador puppy dog as a token of the King of Kings' affection. Given the grotesque reputation of the man, I often wondered why Tehran was not populated with hundreds of stray Labradors. I had dismissed all such thoughts when the dinner ended and I was saying goodbye to my hosts. It was at this moment that the kitchen door burst open and something vast and furry catapulted into me, to the consternation of the couple. I looked up to see the friendly face of a yellow Labrador looking at me as if it had spent all evening waiting to make my acquaintance. Just what life for the Shah was like emerged when the new information ministry, rejoicing in the name of the Ministry of Islamic Guidance, asked us to take a look at the Nayavaran Palace in North Tehran. If Richard III really did offer his kingdom for a horse, then the Shah of Iran paid for his freedom with a clutch of palaces, a heap of priceless Persian carpets, a Marc Chagall sketch, a 22-karat gold 17th century model of a Chinese slave ship, a two-story library, a set of pianos that would send a music college into ecstasy, and 2 solid gold telephones. Lord have mercy. Standing beneath the silver birches on the windy lawn of the Niavaran, an Iranian government official made one of the more historic sales of the century sound like nothing but a momentary hiccup in the progress of the revolution, which was what it would turn out to be. Quote, "We will put the contents up for auction. Then the palaces will be turned into museums." End quote. So we were left to watch a turbaned mullah and 2 men armed with G3 automatic rifles as they pulled and tugged a 30-foot square hand-woven crimson and gold Isfahan rug across the inlaid wooden floor of the Shah's drawing room. Oriental princesses, plumed birds, and exotic beasts of prey were tangled through the arabesque embroideries, and each carpet was neatly tagged with an inventory number, proof that while the revolution might have its ups and downs, Iran's new rulers had a head for efficiency. In the previous few weeks, the Shah's carpets had reportedly raised $15 million. One had to admit that the Shah had the most dreadful taste in furniture. French Baroque chairs nestled against glass and steel tables, while the most grotesque urns, mutated by some silversmith's black magic into ugly peahens, sat upon desks of delicately carved and mosaic-encrusted wood. Walls of cut glass with a powdering of dust upon them suggested a British cinema of the 1930s. This was how the Shah and his wife left their palace in January 1979, when they set off for a, quote, holiday and external exile. Fate does not usually vouchsafe to ordinary folk the right to roam around a Shah's gilded palace, and strange things happen when mere mortals are let loose among such opulence. When the international press were invited into what Abul Hassan Sadiq of the Guidance Ministry sarcastically called the Shah's slum, there were scenes befitting the Ostrogoth descent on Rome. We tripped over piles of carpets and surged into the great library to discover what the Shah read in his spare time. There were leather-bound volumes of Voltaire, Verlaine, Flaubert, Plutarch, Shakespeare, and Charles de Gaulle. The entire works of Winston Churchill rested against Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, a work the Shah might have found suitable reading on his long journey of exile. And biographies of Mahatma Gandhi, My People by Abba Eban, the former Israeli foreign minister. In fact, his book was partly written by an editor of Commentary magazine, lay on a lowly shelf with the author's handwritten dedication to, quote, His Imperial Majesty the Shah of Shahs, end quote. On another rack were the Goebbels diaries. In the Shah's personal office, the guards could scarce restrain us from dialing a line on the golden telephones. On a balcony above the living room, a youth with a rifle over his shoulder watched with an expression of perceptible concern while I played an execrable two-finger version of Bach's Air on a G-string on a harpsichord presented to the Shah by King Baudouin and Queen Fabiola of the Belgians. Souvenir hunters would be able to bid for the toys that once belonged to Princess Leila, the Shah's 8-year-old daughter. Miniature aircraft and toy bears lay near a cupboard not far from her 4-poster bed. On a sideboard there was a photograph of the American president's family with a handwritten greeting, quote, with best wishes, Rosalind and Amy Carter, end quote. A blackboard carried Leila's first efforts at writing in chalk, the European version of Arabic numerals. In the Shah's study, the desk calendar still registered the 16th of January, the day on which the monarch left his realm. In the golden ashtray, I found 5 dusty cigarette ends, testimony to the last depressed hours of imperial rule. We had been taken earlier to the slums of South Tehran in a heavy-handed, though quite effective effort by the guidance of ministry to point up the different lifestyles of the Shah and his people. Children played upon the earth floor of number 94 Gord-Najin Palace, and women carried their washing over open drains. Tehran's slums were less poverty-encrusted than Cairo's tenements, and the Shah's palace was modest by Saudi standards. But we got the point, even if the smell of sewage did mix oddly with the expensive perfumes of the ministry girls. There was much that was odd about Tehran. The sheer normality of the great, dirty, traffic-clogged city was more astounding than the crisis in Iranian-American relations. For all the talk of fanatical mobs and economic chaos, I could still catch the number 20 bus, a green-painted Leyland double-decker, into the center of town, go shopping for French clothes in expensive stores, or call in for a snack at the local Kentucky Fried Chicken. Iranians weaned on the American way of life could no longer buy Skippy peanut butter or Kraft cheese spread at the Forshag Bozorg department store, and, in keeping with Khomeini's views on the general appearance of women, French and American cosmetics had been banned. Tehran was not an attractive city by either Western or Oriental standards. Its square blocks and the architectural poverty of the shop facades built in the 1960s gave the place a sterile, curiously Eastern European air. Even Tehranis, however, were still having problems with their city's political geography, for nearly every main street in the capital had undergone an identity change in accordance with revolutionary instructions. Thus, Pahlavi Street disappeared to become Dr. Hossein Fatimi Street, named after Mossadegh's foreign minister, who was executed 2 months after Operation Ajax, and there's an asterisk there that goes to. These changes were nothing to the problems afflicting the editor of the Times Atlas in London. On December 13th, I received a message from Barry Winkleman of Times Books, asking for the new names of Pahlavides in Kurdistan, Reza Shah Pahlavi Reservoir north of Despul, and Shareza south of Isfahan. In Tehran, he wanted to know, quote, what was the old name of Taligani Avenue? End quote. Answer, Takht-e-Jamshid Street. And to return where we were, the Reuters News Agency Bureau in Tehran became a place of spiritual repair. When I first pushed open the door, I found its bureau chief, Harvey Morris, surrounded by clouds of thick cigarette smoke, with an open bottle of scotch on his desk, and a look of pained surprise on his face. With his Mark Twain mustache and unruly hair, Harvey found the revolution as outrageous as it was brave, as farcical as it was cruel. He had to protect his staff from the comites, keep his Iranian freelancers out of prison, and soft-soap the Ministry of Islamic Guidance, and it was the ministry that was causing him his latest crisis. Quote, they told me they want to know the history of the Reuters News Agency, he announced with a frown. So the great and the good at my London office have just sent me a tome about our esteemed founder, Paul Julius Frere von Rauter, to give to the ministry. But it turns out that the good baron built half the bloody railways in this country, and the Rauter Concession of 1872 granted British subjects a monopoly over the entire economic and financial resources of Iran. Christ, how can I tell the arseholes at the ministry that the founder of our news agency was worse than the fucking Shah? End quote. I saw his point, but Harvey was a smart guy. His laid-back, tired appearance a disguise behind which lay an able, humorous, and sometimes a wicked mind. I would drop by to punch my copy on his wire machine each evening and tell him what I'd learned from my day's street reporting or my travels outside Tehran. He would tip me off on press conferences or scandals, like the one in which television head Kopzeda ordered his secretary to photocopy a bunch of official papers in which she found a letter from his French mistress. The letter was duplicated 1,000 times. My hotel phone would sometimes ring in the morning with a call from Harvey. Quote, "Fisky, you might just like to know that Kalkali's lads have topped another bunch of folks for being, quote, corrupt on earth," end quote. Or more frequently, he'd announce that there was quote, a demonstration outside the American embassy, "Better you than me," end quote. It is strange that the seizure of the U.S. Embassy and its aftermath should have become so tedious an assignment for journalists. After all, it was to lead to an abortive U.S. military rescue mission and, ultimately, the destruction of Carter's presidency. It created a burning sense of humiliation within subsequent U.S. administrations that led America into a series of political and military disasters in the Middle East. Most of the U.S. diplomats and other American hostages remained captive for 444 days. They were only freed after the U.S. and Iranian governments agreed on a series of complex economic and banking arrangements, at which point the captives were taken to Mehrabad airport and escorted out of Iran by Algerian commandos. Perhaps it was the impossible equation which the embassy occupation represented. The Americans were no more going to hand the Shahs back to Iranian justice than the Iranians were going to release their captives until Washington had been sufficiently humbled. Removing the Shah from his New York hospital bed and dumping him in Panama was not going to satisfy the revolutionaries in Tehran, and so each day we would watch the tens of thousands of demonstrators, students, armed guards, and members of Muslim organizations streaming past the embassy, now officially referred to as the, quote, U.S. nest of spies, end quote, hurling to heaven their demand for the Shah's immediate return and condemning President Jimmy Carter as a warmongerer. They became familiar to the point of monotony. Their cry of quote, "down with the Carter, down with the Shah," end quote, would be taken up for 6 or 7 minutes, interspersed with, quote, "Yankee, go home," end quote. Hamburger stands, beetroot juice sellers, and postcard stalls cluttered the roadside. The crowds were strategically placed to catch the television cameras, and journalists were allowed, indeed encouraged, to approach the embassy and stare through the black wrought iron gates. The hostages locked in the main embassy buildings, the men with their hands tied, could not be seen, although students had spray-painted slogans on the roof of the reception block. Just inside the forecourt, they now erected a painting 5 meters high, a symbolic work inspired by Joe Rosenthal's photograph of U.S. Marines raising the stars and stripes on Iwo Jima in 1945. In this case, however, Muslim revolutionaries had replaced the Marines, and they were struggling to raise a green Islamic flag, one end of which had miraculously turned into a hand strangling the stars and stripes. The occupation had thus become theater, complete with painted scenery. It was more than this. It was a carnival. It was also a mistake to believe that this represented a falsehood. Individual Iranians expressed their contempt for the Shah all too eloquently, and all too often in American accents. Quote, "You want to know why we want the damned Shah?" End quote. A student at Tehran Polytechnic University asked me. Quote, well, I'll tell you. It's 'cause that man stole $50 billion from Iran. End quote. An Iranian Air Force private wandered up to join our conversation. Quote, "That bastard staged the biggest heist in history." End quote, he said. The airman's accent sounded like East Side New York City, and it said more about Iran's relationship with America than any amount of political rhetoric. Never before, it seemed, had so many revolutionaries lived, worked, or been educated in the country which they now held responsible for so much of their past suffering. And there's an asterisk that goes to Ireland in 1920 also comes to mind. During the Shah's rule, there were sometimes 500,000 Iranians in the United States. Many were at American universities or colleges. Some were escaping from the Shah's regime. Many thousands were undergoing military training. One of the perks available to Iranian army officers was a regular free trip to New York on an Iranian Air Force jet. Dr. Ibrahim Yazdi, who had just resigned as foreign minister, worked for 17 years as a doctor in America, associating with Iranian students opposed to the Shah. Dr. Mustafa Chamran, not sure how to pronounce that, sorry, who had been appointed assistant prime minister in July 1979 and was to die a martyr in the Iran-Iraq War, helped set up the Islamic Students Association in America in 1962, together with Yazdi and Sadiq Kospeda, now the acting minister of National Guidance. An Iranian girl who had studied journalism in New York, who had experienced, as she put it, the fruits of American democracy, demanded to know why Americans were prepared to support the Shah's regime when it had opposed individual freedom and dissent. Quote, "In the United States, we learned all about liberty and the freedom to say what we wanted to say. Yet America went on propping up the Shah and forcing him to squander Iran's wealth on arms. Why did it do that? Why was America a democracy at home and a dictator abroad?" End quote. There was, of course, a contradiction here. The fact that President Carter, whose campaign for human rights was well known in Iran, should have continued to honor America's political commitment to the Shah before the revolution, in however tentative a way, was regarded as hypocrisy. Yet the Carter administration was opposed to the anti-democratic nature of the Shah's regime, and, within the limits of diplomacy, Carter had urged the Iranian monarch to liberalize his country. Iranians argue that this was too ambiguous a position to respect, and it was difficult to read some of Carter's statements during the last months of the Shah's rule without sensing a certain naivete in the American president. In November 1978, for example, Carter was describing the Shah as a, quote, "a friend, a loyal ally," end quote. He would say only that criticism of the Shah's police state was, quote, "sometimes perhaps justified," end quote, adding that he did not know the details of the criticism. Yet Iranian condemnation often seemed directed at the actions of previous American administrations, at the Eisenhower or Kennedy or Nixon governments. The students, when they shouted abuse about Carter, appeared to be voicing sentiments they once felt about the policies of Henry Kissinger, who had so powerful a role as U.S. Secretary of State when they themselves worked and lived in the United States. Comparatively, few had any experience of the Carter administration, except for the knowledge that Carter refused to deport the Shah of Iran. Few of the students outside of the embassy gave much thought to the long-term outcome of the embassy occupation, to the possibility that it might result in the election of Ronald Reagan, who would take a much less tolerant interest in world affairs, and now a much greater enthusiasm for Iran's external enemies. Iranian reaction to the smaller, quote, satanic powers were almost quixotic. Sorry, let me search that word because I do not know that word. Where'd it go? Quixotic. Caught up in the romance of noble deeds and the pursuit of unreachable goals, idealistic without regard to practicality, impulsive, like Don Quixote, romantic to extravagance, prone to pursue unrealizable goals, absurdly chivalric, apt to be deluded. Okay. Iranian reaction to the smaller, quote, satanic powers was almost quixotic. I think that's how you pronounce that. Quixotic. Powers was almost quixotic. At the British embassy, still daubed with paint from earlier demonstrations, a crowd arrived to express its satisfaction that Shapur Bakhtiar, the Shah's last prime minister, had not been given asylum in the United Kingdom. When the same demonstrators reached the French embassy, the country in which Bakhtiar had been given temporary residence, they expressed their appreciation at the sanctuary France had given Ayatollah Khomeini before the revolution. But no political démarche could unscramble the U.S. Embassy siege. The Europeans, the Papal Nuncio, Sean McBride, a founder of Amnesty International, 75 ambassadors representing the entire diplomatic corps in Tehran, all found their appeals ignored. The ambassadors could not even visit Bruce Langan, who was in the Iranian Foreign Ministry when the embassy was taken and remained there until his release in 1981. Ayatollah Khomeini sternly informed the Pope that, quote, Jesus Christ would have punished the Shah, end quote. Iranian television broke into a showing of The Third Man to announce that Iran was halting its daily supply of 600,000 barrels of oil to the United States, a rather hurried response to the decision already taken by the Carter administration to suspend oil imports from Iran. On the 14th of November, Iran announced the withdrawal of $12 billion of government reserves from American banks, and Carter promptly froze Iranian funds in the United States. Each new step reinforced the power of the theocracy governing Iran and reduced the influence of the leftists. 500,000 students gathered near Tehran University on the 15th of November in support of the Fedayeen, the left-wing guerrilla movement which was now illegal in Iran and which had not supported the embassy takeover. But inside the campus of Tehran University, I found Mehdi Bazarjan at Friday prayers, sitting in a gray sweater, cross-legged on the ground, and listening to Ayatollah Hussein Ali Montazeri, the head of the committee of experts who had just written the new Islamic constitution for Iran. He was telling his audience that, quote, the will of the Iranian people was behind the occupation, end quote, of the embassy. Yazdi sat next to Bazarjan, who had just resigned because the embassy siege had undermined his government. Article 5 of Montazeri's new constitution stated that a religious leader with majority support, quote, a just, pious, enlightened, courageous, and sagacious person, end quote, would become guardian of the nation. It was obvious that this arduous, not to say spiritually wearying role would be given to none other than Ayatollah Khomeini. In this new theocracy, there was going to be no place for the communist Tudeh party. After the overthrow of Mossadegh in 1953, the Shah had executed some of its leaders. Others fled the country. Soon it would be the party's fate to be crushed all over again, this time by Khomeini. But in the winter of 1979, it was still officially supporting the Ayatollah, even if Noruddin Kianori's office walls were the only ones in Tehran without a picture of the Imam. There was a copper plate portrait of Lenin above the stairs, and the Secretary-General of Tudeh frowned when I asked him why the Ayatollah was not staring stiffly down upon his desk. Quote, the cult of personality does not exist here in Iran. We are not like the English. We have a picture of the Queen hanging in every room. We are not like the English, who have a picture of the Queen hanging in every room, end quote. Kianori laughed rather too much at this joke, aware that the parallel was somewhat inexact. He was a precise, faintly humorous man whose balding head, large eyes, and bushy gray mustache made him look like a character from a great French novel. But the political language of this former professor, Tehran University and the East Berlin Academy of Architecture, had more in common with Pravda than with Zola. Tudeh was involved in, quote, the radical struggle against imperialism and the struggle for the reorganization of social life, especially for the oppressed strata of society, end quote. The party wanted a popular democracy, not the bourgeois variety so popular in the West, and insofar as it was possible, Tudeh, Iran's oldest political party, wanted the same things as Ayatollah Khomeini. This was the theory, and Kianori held to it bravely. The truth was that Tudeh's views on the new Iran were almost exactly the same as those of the Soviet Union, which, for the moment, was in favor of the Ayatollah. And I'm going to end it there for now. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.